Hello, this is Dr. Khashayar Rafat-Zand. We're back with the third episode of our election series of the Uniting Inquiry podcast. I remain in the presence of Mr. Karim Boulos, my great friend. And Karim, what are we talking about today?
Nice to be back, Khashy. Today we're going to continue in our third of 5 installments, and we're going to be looking at the Parti Québécois. But before we do that, I had a quick question for you. We know that the political arena, being what it is, attracts more seniors than young people for the election. We expect it to be somewhere around 60% total voter turnout if things go well. So seniors are at the top of everybody's mind, and I'm sure the Parti Québécois is no exception. But before that, what about the demographic of the seniors? What do we think about them? The whole notion of how we treat, and CHSLD aside, what about the resource allocation to senior care, senior services, senior health needs? What do you feel about that in terms of an overarching, regardless of who wins the election, as an overarching issue?
Right, and I think two things. I'm going to talk about climate change, which according to the poll is on top of everyone's, a lot of people, I think it's third in the ranking, right? It's the housing and housing and inflation, healthcare, and then climate change. Yeah. And we see that the young are very active about climate change. And the argument is, we want you to take care of us in the future, correct?
Right.
We want us to consume less gas so that they have a better future. There's a way of turning this request or demand or need around on its head to bringing the healthcare for a senior population, so that I would turn to the younger and non-seniors and say, hey, remember the climate change? You want sensitivity in another time? Now it's time for you to show sensitivity for the people who need it now. You're not seniors now, but there are people now that you can be more sensitive. So there is a cultural conversation that we can have to sensitize the young population to the people who are kind of senior and they will become in the future.
So first is awareness, raising awareness and making them sensitive to the fact that, hey, you're going to get old one day as well, even though they don't believe you. It is something that they have to keep in mind. What else?
Yeah, and I think it's very hard to find someone who has not been touched in one degree of separation. I'm talking about the youth, the grandmothers, the granddaughters, some cousin has not been affected by this terrible pandemic. So there is a personal experience, and the current youth is also very sensitive to kind of disasters like we had during the pandemic. So I think, unfortunately, we paid a high price for this awareness, but I hope we can kind of capitalize on that and not lose it. So what was the other question? We talked about the seniors in what way?
Well, we talked about the whole notion of allocating, the resources. And so making the youth or the young people who will one day get old aware of it is one part of it. But then there's the actual allocation. Is that a priority? Is that something parties should be looking at? I mean, for their political future, it's something they need to look at because seniors vote.
Sure.
But societally speaking, from a point of view of a societal model, is it something that needs to be top of mind?
Well, I think it already is. Again, we give senior discounts. We put them in priorities. We give them, senior parking spaces, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no cultural disagreement, societal disagreement, that we owe some form of contribution to what they have already contributed to society. That is not a question. But the difficulty there, and I'm not saying the difficulty because this is a bad idea, but the difficulty in doing this great thing, which probably is a mark of a better society, a society that takes better care of their elderly. And let's go back to the jar analogy. The jar is fixed. The seniors are out, the marble is out. We drop the marble in, take a bunch of things out, which is fine. The problem is this marble is going to grow in the place. Why? Because we are an aging population. And the older we get, the more expensive we become. And there's like the care, and that's the problem everywhere that you see with the aging population. The healthcare expenses are increased disproportionately to the aging population just by the number of people.
So that's actually very interesting that you say that, because the Parti Québécois, if we'll jump into their platform, their overarching message and the takeaway they want to leave you with is allocating more resources to primary care. And given that these costs, as you say, will increase as one ages, then this might be a good idea. I know the purpose of this podcast is not to say what's good and what's bad, but there's something to be said for that. So I'd like your take on the notion, and they want to address that increase in resources by boosting the capacities of the CLSC. So the CLSC network to provide the care for minor emergencies, preventative care, neighborhood or local, right? That's many parties talk about local services as opposed to mega hospitals. So what do you say to that? I mean, that's really their overarching theme in their platform.
I think it's a very fundamental notion. Primary care has to be given by primary sites. We should not take care of a simple problem in a tertiary care center. It's a waste of everyone's money and talent and capacities.
Just for the viewers, what do you mean by tertiary care?
Let's say if I get a cold, I should not go to University of McGill. There should be somewhere that can take me without me having to present myself to the emergency room of a hospital that does transplants, that does cardiac surgery, that does neurosurgery.
So you say primary, what would be secondary care?
Well, secondary is somewhere in between.
Okay.
A tertiary care is like usually university hospital, a referral center. I have a patient, I cannot deal with them. I send them from the West Island point of view, quote unquote, downtown.
Okay, very good. Okay, so then there is merit to the idea of again, in the same vein of distancing or making some of the delivery of service closer to the actual patient. There is validity to it. What about the structure? How do you make the CLSCs more autonomous for minor emergencies?
Can I go a little bit back on the
Sure.
Because we said that the senior care marble is going to grow. So if we succeed in addressing this, we need to have strategies that are allowed those resources to be available for this. We said that you can throw $1 million at a current problem as a Band-Aid solution. and that's going to be gone in a month, in 2 months. Or you can throw it on something which is infrastructure, and then kind of ensure yourself that your expenses are going to grow, but you've taken already care of this. So I think whoever wants to invest in a growing marble needs to redirect the funds to things that pay in the long term. Now, they may not be able to be there to reap the benefits after the four-year cycle is over, but I think that's a necessity. And those in healthcare, in Quebec healthcare, that really is one thing at the moment. It's my opinion as a subject matter expert in my subspecialty, and it's electronic communication. We cannot have paper, faxes, and complications in transfer of medical information. So
it's interesting you say that, because what we've seen over the last few years, and it's not the CAQ at all, this is prior, we've seen smaller hospitals close, in favor of the CHUM, the CUSUM. So what you're saying is maybe not smaller hospitals, but even smaller still, structures like the CLSC, which, as you say, you're not going to reap those benefits in 4 years, but creating a network that delivers local care.
Correct. So, no, it's correct. And this is one thing that seems to be the reverse of the other countries where the healthcare system is in a better shape. It's one of the things I learned in my IMHL class was that there was Henry Mintzberg. Change starts at the periphery. Mm-hmm. That's a wonderful idea. This is in another platform we're going to come across, that we need smaller clinics everywhere, that the patient has to walk 2 blocks to get the care. And if they say, we can't help you, and then they go to another secondary, finally a tertiary care, rather than just go to the McGill because the emergency is always open, or go to the CHUM because at some point they're going to be seen. So there's huge merit in that.
And in the final point that I wanted to just touch on, because I think the CLSC model, or the further from the the core delivery is important. Like the Liberals that we discussed earlier, the Parti Québécois is suggesting physicians take on more patients. Now, as a layperson, that seems contradictory to the idea of decentralizing it a little bit by removing the pressure on the central system. What do you feel about that? Is that something that the Parti Québécois idea, does it make sense to put pressure on physicians to take on more patients?
Well, I mean, the doctors, let's use the jar analogy for a doctor. You know, a doctor is a jar. It has a certain capacity. If you put 5,000 patients in this jar, if you want to put 1,000 more, something's got to give. Either the jar is going to get bigger, the doctor need to put more work, or the marbles have to get smaller. That is the time that a doctor has to spend with each patient.
Right.
And I think the jar is full. I speak of myself and everyone I know around me that we are overworked. You know, you can't pay me enough to work more.
Right.
I will completely reject that proposition.
It's interesting you say that, because there's people will be asked, if the doctor sees 30 patients in a day, do you want to be number 1 or number 30 that the doctor sees? And everyone would say number 1. So I think that intuitively we understand what this means, and so taking on extra patients isn't necessarily a positive from a neutral. I'm not referring to the party. The Parti Québécois has its perspective, but on the CLSC front, I think that decentralized and walking 2 blocks to see your doctor is certainly something to be considered. And again, whoever wins the election should keep that in mind.
I think asking the doctor to take more patients is a great thing to do. Forcing them is not. You can accomplish that, but going to them and say, what do you need to increase your throughput 20%? Okay. Everyone's going to say, take the papers away. I want to be able to communicate adequately. I need an assistant so that instead of seeing patients, I don't have to make phone calls. Right. Ask them, and they have a lot of answers for you. And this really goes back to the same thing we talked about, infrastructure. If you put the electronic medical records here, people will see more patients automatically. It makes the work more enjoyable. But don't make that decision for a doctor who's trained to make the decisions by themselves.
That's a great closing line, Khashy. Thank you very much. I think you made it very clear, and I think there are some merits to the Parti Québécois platform. I think it makes sense, and I think that regardless of who wins, if they can listen to and integrate certain aspects, and I like the idea of that CLSC network being put to better use. Absolutely. Thanks again for your very insightful commentary.
My pleasure, Karim. You're a great conversationalist. Thank you.